Welcome everybody to CF Live and our discussion about genetic therapies. I'm Michelle Shaw, I have CF and I'm a trustee of the CF Trust. I'll be chairing this evening together with my co-host Lauren. Lauren, can you quickly introduce yourself please?
Hi, I'm Lauren. I work at the Trust within the Clinical Trials Accelerator Platform team.
Thank you. So the purpose of tonight's evening is to talk to you about genetic therapies, to provide you with an update of where we're at in terms of potential access to trials, and to provide you with a supportive forum to enable you to ask questions directly to our panellists. So we have Professor Jane Davies, Dr. Jamie Duckers and Dr. Tim Lee. So this event will be recorded and it will be available to watch again on the Trust website. So if you haven't managed to attend it this evening, it is a hot day, the information will still be there and accessible. We've received several questions in advance of this evening, so we'll try and get through as many of them as we can, but we will encourage you to submit questions as you go through this event. You can do that by submitting them on the chat function. We'll get through as many of them as we can, and those that we can't, we'll try and provide some follow-up. So we're going to start by asking our panellists to address three very specific questions about genetic therapies. And once we've done that, we'll then take questions from the audience and we'll do a question and answer session. So first, I'd like to ask our panel members to introduce themselves, please. If we can do it in the order that they'll be speaking to us later. So Jamie, can you start, please?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Hi, everyone. I'm Jamie Duckers. I'm based in Cardiff at the All Wales Adult CF Service. So my job is to help provide care for adults living with cystic fibrosis from all across Wales. The other part of my job is I'm the research lead here in our service and for respiratory trials across Wales. And I'm also a clinical lead for rare disease in Wales. And that's probably why I'm really interested in the potential for genetic therapies for cystic fibrosis. So thanks for asking me along today.
Fantastic, thank you. And Jane?
Hello everyone, I'm Jane Davies. I'm a paediatrician by training, so my clinical work is at the Royal Brompton Hospital and is involved with children with cystic fibrosis and other rare and severe respiratory diseases. But I have a job that's 3/4 research, and my research really spans the life course of people with CF. I have a big interest in infection, but I also co-lead the trials team at the Brompton, who's part of the CTAP and the European CTN network. We have a particular interest in more sensitive outcome measures, particularly for children, such as the lung clearance index. And I'm really interested in this genetic therapies field because for about 20 or 25 years, I've been working as part of the UK CF Gene Therapy Consortium, now led by Eric Alton out of our centre. Many of you will be familiar with that. And we've already done a couple of clinical trials of non-viral gene therapy within the last decade or so. So very, very pleased to be here and looking to the future and to see what might be different.
Wow, thanks for joining us, Jane. And thirdly, Tim.
Yes, thank you for the invitation. I'm Tim Lee, so I'm a paediatric consultant from Leeds, obviously the north of England, and we've got a large network of 240 people, young people with cystic fibrosis who attend our service. I'm very conscious of the people that don't have access to effective therapies, people that don't have the right mutations for modulators, and therefore really interested in tonight's event. And in terms of the research side, I did a PhD in liposome-mediated gene delivery, which is a lab-based PhD, so have a lot of interest in the science behind gene therapy. So yeah, very much looking forward to tonight's event. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. So if I hand over to Lauren now, and she'll take us through the first three questions via the polls.
Thank you. So we wanted to start by making this a little bit interactive. So we have three poll questions, which we would like the audience to answer. They're true or false questions, and we'll go through one at a time, and then one person from the panel will answer each question and talk to each question once we have the responses. So hopefully the first poll will appear on everyone's screen now. So the question is, true or false, genetic therapies could be available for everyone, regardless of which form of CF or CF mutation they have. Okay, so hopefully you can all see the responses coming up. 80% have answered true, 7% have answered false to this question, and 13% have answered I don't know. So quite a remarkably high percentage have answered true to this question. So I wonder if Jamie, you might be able to comment on the answer to this question and elaborate a little bit.
Thanks, Lauren. Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? Really interesting, because we look about what the sort of questions we get asked in clinic. So that's interesting. It reflects that really. So I guess there's a bit of confusion, I think, around the term genetic therapies. It's a bit of an umbrella term. And just to clarify that, it involves RNA therapies, gene editing, and gene transfer. And I know it's not a great analogy, but what we talk about in the clinic, if you imagine one of the famous sort of flat pack furniture brands that we all know, if you imagine that their sort of central office in the middle of the store, they've got a computer and it's got an instruction manual on how you make that, say, bedside cabinet. That's like your DNA there. And then you print it off, and we've all tried to follow the sort of instruction manual that comes with it, isn't it? That's like your mRNA, if you like, your messenger RNA. It tells you how to build that. And then if you think the bedside cabinet you're trying to make is like the protein. So for our people with CF, that protein is the channel, if you like, the chloride channel that lets chloride ions go in and out, essentially water moving in and out of the cell. And I think some of the confusion is around the new modulator therapies, so that people have heard of, either Kaftrio, Simkevi, or can be Kaftrio. They're not actually genetic therapies, so they don't change that blueprint on the computer or that, if you like, that printed out manual that you get with your bedside cabinet. But for about 90% of people with CF in the UK, they are eligible to receive these. And how they work is they try and, for these people, they make a protein, but it's not quite functioning properly. And what these medications do is to help the protein work better and be more of it, and at the cell surface to be more productive, if you like. And there's been some great results with that. But it's for those sort of maybe just less than 10% of people living with CF in the UK that are ineligible for those treatments. And that's because their blueprint in the office computer just doesn't really print out any useful information on that booklet. And so you can't really make your bedside table. There's nothing there being produced. And so these medications don't work for that group of people. And that's where all the excitement is about these gene therapies, because you've got a couple of options of what you could do with the gene therapies. So you could get into that central office in the flat pack furniture, and you could log on to the computer, and you could try and fix that code, if you like. And that's called gene editing. So there's some trials, I know we'll talk about it later, not in CF yet, but in some other rare diseases like sickle cell, there are some potential gene editing trials that have happened. The other thing you could do is to just upload a whole new blueprint. So this is gene transfer, and there are trials coming for that in people with CF, and we can talk about those coming through. I guess the other thing you could do is not break into the central office, but you could get that paper copy and you could change it slightly. So this is editing your mRNA or making changes to your mRNA, and there are trials of that coming. Or you could just provide a whole new booklet, a printed booklet. And again, there are trials of those mRNA changes coming. So in answer to the question, yes, the 80% of people are right. These therapies could eventually be for everybody, but where most of the interest is concentrated at the moment is for those people that have got no treatments available for them. And they may well use these genetic therapies in addition to the modulator drugs to improve the outcomes. But eventually, these therapies could come and be available and useful for people with all different types of cystic fibrosis. So I hope that helps, Lauren. And I know we'll talk more about it later on, won't we?
No, that's great, and a great analogy. Thank you. So we'll move on to the second poll question, which will hopefully be on everyone's screens very shortly. And this is another true or false question, and it's true or false, genetic therapies offer a potential cure for CF. And there's a I don't know option as well for people who are unsure. So this one has a very mixed response. 36% have answered true, and another 36% have answered false, and 29% have answered I don't know. And this is quite an interesting question and answer, I think. So Jane, I wonder if you would be willing to reflect on this.
Well, I absolutely love questions that get a mixed response like this, because they're really interesting to talk about. I think the first thing I'd say is that I suspect different people have different definitions of the word cure. And I didn't obviously answer the question, but had I answered the question, my own personal view is that the real meaning of a word cure is you go in for some treatment and you leave and you don't have that disease anymore. So for example, someone who's had a bone marrow transplant for, you know, an untreatable genetic disease and leaves, and they don't have that disease anymore. For me, I think all of the cystic fibrosis treatments that are around at the moment, I wouldn't use that word cure, even for the very highly effective modulators. In the case of the drugs, for example, although they do address multiple different parts of the body, and one could almost say almost all parts of the body, if you decide to stop taking them, then at some point the disease is still there and it comes back and the symptoms will come back. So they are certainly not a cure. They need to be given long-term and maintained. And I think there is a potentially slightly different issue about the genetic therapies. So firstly, Jamie did a fantastic job of explaining the different types of genetic therapies. If we go through them perhaps individually, because I think there are different issues related to this use of the word cure. The messenger RNA therapies, so the blueprint replacement, if you like, those blueprints don't last very long. You know, you expose them to sunlight and they fade or something, but they just don't keep working. So you need to really give messenger RNA very frequently, possibly several times a week or even daily. And that to me underlies probably the wrong term in terms of using cure. There are some longer lasting genetic approaches, which would include actually inserting DNA in some cases into the genetic makeup of the person. And those ones could last for very, very much longer. And we don't yet know because they haven't been in humans. But in some of those approaches in animal models have lasted for example, for the lifetime of a mouse, which is 2 years. So one could say, oh, well, maybe you'd be happy to call that a cure. The problem, I think, in terms of the use of that word is that they are administered directly to the airways, so the lungs. And I think that the best we're going to achieve with those, therefore, is to get improvement in the lung consequences of cystic fibrosis. But of course, as everyone on the call knows, there are multiple different organs involved also. And the current, the current way in which we administer those treatments won't be able to address the gut or the pancreas or the liver or any of those other organs which are affected in people with CF. So I think that's the other reason why, personally, I don't use the word cure. I think it potentially raises the bar very, very high in terms of expectations. And I think, as we've seen with the modulators, we can achieve fantastic impacts and really change people's quality and quantity of life without resorting to the use of the word cure. Now, the one exception that I think you could pull me up on this is that Jamie mentioned gene editing, and that is getting some way of repairing and actually changing the genetic makeup of the cells. This is a long way off, in my opinion. There are attempts to do this in the lungs. One could look into the future and say, if that works and if it's safe, might people do something like this, for example, to a woman who's pregnant and knows that she is carrying a fetus who's affected with cystic fibrosis? I think I couldn't rule that out happening at some point in the future, but I don't think we are anywhere near it at the moment. And for me, context in which I might think actually the use of the word cure was appropriate. So I think the correct answer, I don't think that it some of the massive impacts that we possibly could have. And many of the trials and the approaches that are around at the moment are benchmarking themselves against the sort of impacts that are achieved with Kaftrio in the lung, and are hoping to gain benefits to that sort of magnitude. Now, time will tell. Obviously, we need the trial data to be able to understand whether that is going to be the case. But I think there's an enormous amount of optimism and fantastic energy in the field at the moment. We've all just come back from the European CF conference, and I've never been to a conference where there was quite so much talk about genetic therapies. So there's certainly a huge momentum in there, and a lot of focus on this subgroup of people who can't currently benefit from the new drugs that we've got available to us.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jane. So I think we'll go on to the final poll, which has hopefully just appeared on everyone's screens. And again, another true or false question. Taking genetic therapy treatments would modify my DNA. True, false, and there's also an I don't know. Another interesting mix. We've got 20% have answered true, 60% have answered false, and 20% have answered I don't know. So Tim, would you be happy to talk to this question?
Absolutely. Well, thank you, everybody. That's really interesting. And I think when I pondered this question beforehand, I agreed with the majority that in the majority of cases, the answer to this question is no, that the genetic therapies currently in development aren't generally going to alter our DNA. But I would say some of the later gene therapy approaches that we're probably aiming towards in the long term will. So if I can go through this in turn, we've already heard about some of the different gene therapy approaches. So there's messenger RNA therapy, which both Jamie and Jane talked about. And that certainly doesn't alter your own DNA. It doesn't go anywhere near the DNA. The RNA just gets into the cell, doesn't even enter the nucleus. And as Jane said, is just expressed for a very short time. And you might need to redose weekly or multiple times in a week to get continued expression of the correct cystic fibrosis protein. Then there's other forms of RNA therapy that affect people with very specific mutations called splicing mutations. And those are very short sequences of RNA. And again, they would just be delivered into the cytoplasm of the cell, not even reach the nucleus, and wouldn't affect the person's DNA at all. And again, would need to be repeatedly administered to have their effect. Then if we move on to some of the gene therapies that actually deliver DNA into the nucleus of the cell, many of those, and certainly the ones that have been tested so far, again, don't alter the person's actual host DNA, that they just offer additional DNA into the nucleus of the cell that is then read and RNA, and then a protein is formed. So some people on the call may have been involved in the multi-dose liposome gene therapy study that the UK CF Gene Therapy Consortium conducted a few years ago. And you'll remember that gene therapy program worked. It showed we could get expression, and we could get an effect in terms of lung function. But that was just delivering the DNA coding for the correct CF gene using a liposome actually into the nucleus of the cell. And that DNA would last in the nucleus of the cell for a while, but then get degraded and wouldn't in any way alter the existing DNA that's there. It would just be an additive. So the actual incorrect coding of the CF DNA that is within the person with cystic fibrosis's genome was still there. And some of the viral approaches to gene therapy. So at the moment in the United States, they're testing adeno-associated virus, and there's some really promising results coming out, some of which were presented at the European Cystic Fibrosis Conference last week, showing again that we're getting correct protein expression within the lining of the lungs when this viral cystic fibrosis gene therapy vector is delivered. But that DNA, again, doesn't get integrated into the person's own DNA, and it doesn't alter the person's own DNA. So their original cystic fibrosis gene is still there, but there's an additional piece of DNA that the adeno-associated virus has delivered that produces the correct code for the cystic fibrosis protein. As we move on further through gene therapy, and some people on the call may have heard that the UK CF Gene Therapy Consortium is now partnered with Boehringer Ingelheim to develop and conduct a clinical trial using lentivirus, which will deliver the correct code for the cystic fibrosis protein into the cell. That is a vector that would actually alter the host DNA, because that correct sequence for the CF gene would be inserted into the person's DNA within the lining of their lungs, the cells lining the lungs. And that, in theory, has the advantage that the expression of that protein would last a lot longer than with other viral vectors and liposome vectors. So that could offer great benefit. And then, of course, there's the gene editing therapies, which are probably the furthest away from actually being realized, although have already been used in some other conditions, such as eye conditions and blood disorders like sickle cell disease, with some success. So gene editing therapy is now working in other forms of genetic condition. And that, again, would alter the host DNA, because it would cut out the mutated code within the cystic fibrosis coding region of a person's DNA and replace it with the correct code, coding for the correct cystic fibrosis protein. So in summary, I would agree with the 60% of participants that voted for no. But I think in the longer term, we're probably looking for therapies that might well alter the DNA of the person. So I hope that's a useful summary, and thank you for posing the question.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Tim, and thanks to all three of the panelists for addressing those three questions, and thanks to everyone for answering them. So next, I will hand back over to Michelle. We're moving into the kind of more open Q&A session. We've got some pre-submitted questions by people who registered for the event, which we'll try and cover, and we've also got some coming through from the audience. So I think we'll kickstart with a pre-submitted question. So Michelle.
Thanks, Lauren, and thank you for that information to the panelists. There was a lot of information to take in there, but it's so encouraging, and I know there are a lot of parents on the line, and to have access to this information, it's a really uplifting experience listening to it. We do have quite a lot of pre-submitted questions that we'll try and go through, but we do really want to encourage you to ask questions during this event. So we can do it two ways. We can either submit them on the comments section of Zoom, or if you want to put your camera on and raise your hands, that's another option. If we do miss you doing that, feel free to give us a nudge as well in the comments section, and we'll try and get around everybody. If you do put your camera on, please be aware that you will be recorded, and your image will be shown on the website later. But because there was a lot of information there, whilst we give you time to digest it all, I will go into one of the first questions that has been submitted, and it links in with the information that you've all given us. So first question, when do we realistically expect gene therapies to be widely available in the UK? And I know there was a lot of information about different types there, so I was wondering if you could provide the information relating to each of them. And if we go in the same order that we have done in the last round, and start with Jamie, but if Jane and Tim, you'd like to add something at the end, that would be fantastic. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Yeah, it's the $64 million question, isn't it, is when. So we are very fortunate, for example, here in Cardiff, we are one of the early phase Cystic Fibrosis Trust Accelerator platforms. So we've been supported to bring these early phases to people with CF in Cardiff, and there are a range of these centres across the UK. So I think the first one therapy that we're going to be able to trial ourselves here is an inhaled mRNA therapy, and that's with Vertex, and that may well be, hopefully, it's already open in America, We're hoping to open it later on this year in our centre, so probably towards the end of the year, which would be exciting. So this is, if you remember, we were talking about what the mRNA is. This is like the booklet that you get with your flat pack furniture. It's providing a new booklet to help the body make the proteins. So it's an inhaled lipid nanoparticle, and it's going to be for adults, a trial for adults, and it is going to involve coming into hospital for a couple of days, and it's going to involve having a lung function that's above 40% and to 90%. And we're very excited. Initially, it's going to be for people that are ineligible for the modulator therapies. So again, very excited to be able to offer something for those people. And there hopefully will be a lot of excitement about it. And as I said, it's already opened in America. And then, of course, there are other trials that are coming. We talked about the other ones, potentially some of the gene transfer trials that are coming. I don't know if my colleagues want to talk about those, or do you want me to natter on? Up to you guys. So some of those that are coming, there are ones called, I think Tim mentioned it with Boehringer are coming, and there's one called Spiravant and 4D. So there's a range of these, and these are going to be carrying vectors for gene transfer. And again, they're going to be inhaled therapies that will be coming, and they'll be coming initially for adults again, and again for similar lung function restrictions for the people. And I think they'll be slightly behind timeline, so maybe come just after the Vertex trial.
Jane and Tim, would you like to add anything further, or is that a fairly complete?
I think that was very comprehensive. I wasn't sure whether the person asking the question was asking about trials or actually therapies being available, but I'm really glad Jamie chose the one that at least we can answer. You know, I can remember 25 years ago, people hyping up in clinics about when they might be able to get gene therapy, and I think it hasn't served us well at all to be jumping the gun on the clinical trial outcomes. Everybody hopes that every clinical trial is going to work, but the truth is that many of them don't, particularly at the early stages. And of course, we can learn things from those studies, but it does mean that that drug may not go further. So I think it's very important that we manage expectations here. And I'm delighted that there's going to be so much opportunity for people across the UK, and I think largely leveraged by the CTAP early phase program. So it's fantastic that that's been set up to take part in these trials. And we very much hope that there may be some clinical benefit out of the trials, but I'm absolutely out of the game now of predicting a positive outcome and then the next stage and then the next stage and then it being available, because I think there's just no way to do that, and it ends up really disappointing people. So the one thing I would say is that I really don't remember when there's been so much energy in this space. So I strongly think that something's going to work, but I suspect not all of them are going to become prescribable drugs.
Thanks, Jane. It's really exciting. That was a really positive point to move on to the next question, I think. Lauren, I see that we've got 2 questions from Lizzie in the comment section. Yes. I think we've answered the first one, haven't we, there?
Yeah, I think we have. We also have a hand up, so I wonder if we could go with the person first who's got her hand up, if they want to turn their camera on and ask their question, and then we'll continue working through the ones in the chat, if that's okay.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm from Malta, so like I'm not from the UK or anywhere like that, and I have a double G542X mutation, so this is very exciting for me. So as Jane just said, basically it kind of answered my question, that obviously you don't know. I was going to ask how long the trials would last and how many phases you would expect to be having. But obviously, as you said, like you never know if the first phase will be good or not to move on to the next one. So that's very that kind of answers my question. But my second question was the gene transfer trials you mentioned with Boehringer regarding the spiral band. I just took notes. These may be like, I have no idea what I wrote here. When is that trial expected to start, please?
Shall I answer that one?
Yeah, go for it.
So thanks, Francesca. Study startup is sometimes a bit unpredictable, but Professor Eric Alton, who heads up that programme, has said at the UK CF clinical trials meeting that they very much hope to start that study by the end of this year. And that's very exciting, and that is a study that they're actually looking right from the start at whether it improves people's lung function. So right from the start, that's going to be an outcome measure, because that's what they feel people are wanting. They're wanting a gene therapy that is effective enough to improve people's lung function. So that's what we know about that study. I'm not as familiar with the setup times for the Spiravant, but I know that the 4DMT or whatever the drug company is called that's running the AAV study in the USA, that's already started in the USA and will be moving to Europe. So yeah, there's definitely things later this year.
Amazing.
Michelle, would you mind if I just add something to Tim's comment?
Yes, please do.
Francesca, it's a very good question, and Tim's absolutely right that that's certainly what Eric's sort of discussed in the recent past. One of the unknowns, though, and that is outside our control, is the time it takes for what we call regulatory approval. And you're probably aware that since Brexit, we are no longer governed by the European Medicines Agency in the way we used to be, and we are now governed by a group called MHRA. And just watching other trials going for approval at MHRA, I think it's very clear, and Tim, I know that you're quite connected in here, so you may have more of an insight. It seems very much that there is a backlog and that things are taking longer than MHRA normally would commit to. So I think there's a little bit of uncertainty about whether or not the timelines are going to be quite as everyone would wish them to be, and some of that is outside the control, I think, either of the company or the consortium. But Tim, I don't know if you've got anything to add on that, and maybe a glimmer of hope that the backlog is getting smaller.
Well, the MHRA are hoping to have people in post by the end of this month, but whether that happens or not, we wait to see. But hopefully it won't delay things too much.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And I think some of that answered Lizzie's question in the comment section as well. So thank you for that. Lauren, we have another hand up, don't we?
Yes,
it says on, is it Kerry Laidlow?
Yeah.
Have I pronounced that correctly? I do apologise if I haven't.
Pronounced it correctly, but my name's Stephen, obviously, so I'm on my wife's phone. Our question is around whether there's any research going into using stem cells, because when our youngest was born, we saved the cord blood, and we didn't know if there's any research happening with stem cells.
Shall I have a go at that?
Why don't you have a go at that, Jane?
Well, in part because it was an area of research that I looked into some time ago, thinking what a fantastic opportunity this was. It was at a time, probably about 15 or 20 years ago now, where everyone was talking about the potential of stem cells. So the sort of where everything begins in the embryo or in the bone marrow. And their potential really is very, very rich, because they're capable of turning themselves into multiple or even all cell types in the body. And that's why they were thought to be so attractive. So there was some work for quite a long time about the concept of correcting those stem cells with the sort of gene therapies that do change the DNA, and then allowing those cells to, for example, go down a pathway to turn into lung cells and giving them back to the lung. Now, it all sounds really nice and quite sort of simple. The trouble is there's an awful lot of problem getting those stem cells to go to the lung. If you put them in onto the airway surface, well, our lungs are really pretty much well designed to keep things out. That's the whole purpose of the lungs, apart from exchanging the oxygen and carbon dioxide. They keep things out, and that's part of the reason why it's so difficult to get even small molecules into the airways. And then there was a thought for a while, well, perhaps we could give these stem cells a bit like a bone marrow transfusion, and maybe they would go into the lungs and repopulate the surface epithelium. I had a very fun project about sort of 15, 20 years ago where I linked in with another group who were giving bone marrow transplants to people with all different types of diseases. And we had this idea that if we went to women who'd received a male bone marrow transplant, that we could brush some of the cells out of their nose and we could see whether or not any of the male chromosome was in those cells. So it seemed like a really neat idea, and I was very excited about it. There had been some evidence from a mouse model that this might work. So you can imagine my excitement the first time I saw the male chromosome lighting up in these samples. When we did a bit more cell staining and figuring out which cells they were all the sort of circulating white blood cells that come through the blood and then get to the airway surface. None of them had turned into the lung epithelial cells or the nose epithelial cells in any examples. So actually, it's very, very difficult. And I think that might be the reason why I've seen virtually nothing on this, I would say, for at least a decade. I don't know whether others have, but I haven't seen anything on it. That said, you know, it's a great resource to have there. And if something does crop up at some point in the future, I'm not saying go and get rid of them or anything. There may be something that my imagination is not seeing at the moment, but I think the barriers to this sort of research are steeper than people were first thinking.
And Jane,
Thank
do
you.
you have anything to contribute to that? That's fascinating, isn't it?
No, but I think it's great that that facility is there. Like Jane said, there may be opportunities in the future, and it's a great the fact that cord blood has been stored. So there may be opportunities, Stephen. But I'm not aware of anything at present.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I see there's another question in the comments section. Lauren, are you happy for me to read that one out?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so this may be a bit of a silly question, but in what form would the gene therapy be given? Pills, injections, nebulizers? I don't think that's a silly question. I think that's a good question. Jamie, would you like to go first? You're the first box I can see on the screen.
Oh yeah, no problem, Michelle. Yes, so the initial trials that we've got coming are for, if you remember, the inhaled mRNA, which is given by a nebulizer. And the other trials that we talked about, so the 4D, the Spirovant, the Boehringer, they're also going to be done with an inhaled mechanism, so nebulized into the lung. So obviously, I think the thing to point out there is that they will be, as Jane mentioned, there's the trick of getting them into the lung, which is some of the difficulty. And obviously what you're actually treating there is you're treating your lung cells, so you're not directly affecting the other organs of the body, if that makes sense. So that might be a slight difference to what people are used to when they talk about the modulator therapies with the Kaftrio or the Simkevi, or either Kaftrio or Cambi. So that's a slight difference. But these initial ones will be done targeting the lung cells, so they will be inhaled using a nebulizer.
Brilliant, thank you very much. What I might do is I might go back to our list of some of the pre-submitting questions just to make sure that we're covering some of those as well. There were a few questions around the age that genetic therapy treatments will be applicable for. So is there a specific age to participate, or a certain age that genetic therapy can be started? And when might genetic therapies especially be available for children? So I'll go, Tim, would you be happy to take this one?
Yeah, thank you. Really good question. And what is very clear about the regulation of gene therapy and genetic therapy studies is that they would always start in adults, so people 18 and over. And that really is to make sure that the risk benefit and all these sorts of things are something that the person themselves can really think about very carefully before they agree to participate in a study, and also that the studies are first done on people that are pretty robust and fully grown, and it's only when a therapy is shown to be safe and effective in adults with cystic fibrosis that it would then be brought down to younger age groups, and that would probably take quite a bit of time. So you'd have, maybe 2 or 3 years after the study in adults, would you then move down to the age group below, and generally that would be 12 and above, and then it would go 6 to 11 years, and then it would go down to the young children. There's a lot to be said that once we get therapies like this working, you'd want to probably start them as soon as possible, because we know people with cystic fibrosis are generally very well when they're born and when they're identified through newborn screening. And that's really when you'd probably get the most long-term benefit, and probably when it might be easier as well to deliver gene therapy before someone's lungs had a lot of mucus in. But certainly these studies and all the ones we've talked about today would be starting in people 18 and above first.
Great, thank you very much. Michelle, have there been any more questions in the chat, or shall we do another pre-submitted question? I can see that there's a question of how do you find out about the trials? I've seen limited ones via the Trust. I might be able to help with this as well. We do have our CF trials tracker, which is on the Trust's website, where we will list a number of sort of relevant CF trials, and we will be listing genetic therapy trials as they become sort of available in the UK. We would also, I'm sure Jamie, Jane and Tim will attest to this, would encourage you to speak to your CF teams about research, and they would be very happy, I'm sure, to talk to you about research opportunities and upcoming trials. So that's always a good way to find out about what opportunities are available.
Can I just add something to that, Lauren?
Yes,
completely
please do.
agree. And I think the trials tracker is an excellent resource. The reason you can't see lots on there yet is because most of these tracks haven't yet opened. So, you may be able to see something about the Vertex Moderna one, which is shortly starting, and that might not even quite be on there yet because it hasn't opened. What I would say is that there is a very clear and widespread recognition that people who may be eligible for these trials at the moment with 2 non-responsive variants in their genes are scattered all over the country. And it shouldn't be reasonable that somebody who happens to live next to one of the centres that's running the trial gets a great opportunity, and somebody who lives further away doesn't get that. So CF Trust, CTAP, has done a lot of work on this, and we're very, very supportive of people being referred from different centres into the sites which are running the various gene therapy trials. So as long as people are able to travel, that travel, etc., will all be reimbursed and refunded, and will allow people to access these trials in a place that isn't their normal clinical care centre, and during which time the clinical care will remain with the original centre. Nobody's trying to sort of poach patients off anyone else, but I think it's a model that's been shown to work in the past. It's certainly how the liposome gene therapy trial worked. We had patients from all over the country coming. And it's absolutely going to be essential for the next stage, because otherwise it's not going to be very fair, and we're not going to get enough people actually into the trials.
Jane, could I add to that question, please? There seems to be various options and various timescales depending on the options. As a person with CF, where do you go to discuss which one is best for you? Do you go for the first one that comes along, or do you wait a bit and see one that's more suitable? And who gives that guidance?
This is such a good and such a difficult question. It's a really, really difficult question. So I suppose that's part of the reason why you're holding events like this, isn't it? So that people can become aware and sort of have awareness that it's not necessarily just one option that they may be able to go for. But sometimes it's very difficult for us to talk openly about things before they are open. You know, all of these trials are being run by companies, and several of us are having a lot of conversations with them about the absolute essential need for patients to be fully informed across the board before they decide which way to jump. And it may be, for example, that one trial is open, but there's another trial that's going to open in 2 or 3 months. We're not yet fully able to be talking about it. So I think it's a piece of work that CTAP and also the European Clinical Trials Network is engaged in at the moment to try and really provide those sorts of pieces of information. But I think once that information is out there, probably the best person to talk to is your own clinical team, because they know you and they know your whole background. They will be able to discuss the pros and cons of the various ones, and then factored into that might be the time frame and how long it's going to have to take you and how far away a trial site is, all of those things. But I would probably start with your own clinical team, and they can get in touch with the trial sites directly. We all know each other. The CF is a lovely small community, and everybody knows each other and really, you know, wants the best out of all this. So there's no problem with the communication in that sort of regard, I think.
Thank you, that's fantastic. Lauren, do you want to go for another one of the pre-submitted questions? And then I've seen that there's another couple on the comments that we can go through after that.
Yes.
Got just over 10 minutes left.
Let me, okay, so I have one pre-submitted question here. My daughter is on Kaftrio, but hasn't had a noticeable impact. Is she a good candidate for new therapy trials, as there is not the moral difficulty of taking her off a very effective treatment? So Jamie, would you like to answer this one?
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. Sorry, I missed how old the daughter was. But
Didn't say.
Okay, just like Tim was saying, that initially for the trials, the age group is going to be above 18. And yes, you're right, we have got a proportion of people that are eligible for the modulator therapies like Kaftrio, for example, and for a variety of reasons either can't tolerate it or haven't seen a huge improvement, actually. And in a couple of the gene transfer trials, actually, they are or not just looking at people whose genetics make them ineligible, but people that haven't had a huge response actually to the Kaftrio. And so it is possible to go into those trials, but just for this person's daughter, they would need to be over 18 for the initial trials. But thinking forward, like we talked about in that first opening section, that you could, the future may be that you're going to be on these genetic therapies and also potentially be on a modulator to maximize the effect. So I'd say it's really optimistic and that it wouldn't exclude her and that she could potentially go on to these therapies in the future, definitely.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks very much. Shall we go back to the person who has their hand up, Kerry, although I know it's not Kerry. If they're there, yeah.
Yeah.
You can ask your question.
My question was, I think, to Jamie around, I believe he said he was like involved as part of a specialist centre. But I just wondered how you know where the other specialist centres are, in case there's one nearby us that we could potentially utilise for our son when he's 18.
Yeah, it's a great question, Stephen. There's 6 early phase centres in the UK that the CF Trust have supported. So we're one in Cardiff. It's probably easier to ask where you are, but the others are in Belfast. There's one in Edinburgh. There's one in Southampton. There's one in the Brompton, and I've forgotten. Is that 6 that I've said?
Manchester.
Manchester. Sorry, Stephen. Yeah, so I don't know where you are, if they're anywhere near you. But like Jane was saying, actually, we're really keen for these trials that even if your local centre is not doing it, that there will be a facility for your local team to look to those centres that we've just mentioned, and they may be really keen to try and facilitate people coming across for trials in those centres. So that's been a real push from particularly from the CF Trust that we want to make access to research equitable for everybody, that everybody can have a chance at getting into research trials that interest them, that they want to be involved in.
Yeah, okay, so thank you. I think for us it'd probably be the Brompton because we're currently at Gosh, so thank you.
Lauren, I think we've got a couple on the comments and then we have another hand up. So if I can just read out the question from Tonya. If a person with CF had NTM in the past, would this stop them from being able to participate in gene therapy trials? Jane, can we come back to you on that one, please?
So it's a very good point, Tanya, and there have been in almost all trials I've ever been involved in some sort of exclusion criteria for people who have infection with what most protocols describe as associated with a more rapid rate of clinical decline. And the non-tuberculous mycobacteria, or at least some of them, do have that feature. I think in general, things are improving a little in terms of saying how long ago the person needed to have it. And if it's in the sort of distant past and there's no evidence of current infection, then most of the protocols I've seen recently wouldn't rule that person out. I think if somebody still has active infection, then it depends a little bit on the detail of which type of NTM it is and whether it's one of the ones that it tends to be associated with worse disease. And I'm sorry to say that currently I think most of those ones, if you're actively infected and then receiving treatment for them, they probably are exclusions at the moment. But it's really important to remember that exclusion criteria in clinical trials don't then apply once an effective drug has its license and is being used in the clinic. Unless there's some sort of drug interaction or something like that, just being on treatment with sort of infections wouldn't mean that you had any less a chance of getting once it was available and also from benefiting from it.
Jane, do you mind if I ask a further question on that, please? Is that because of the risk of cross-infection, or is it because of lung function?
I think it's not really because of the risk of cross-infection, because we're all very, very careful with any sort of interpatient contact in our trials facilities, as we are in our clinics at the moment. I think it's more because if you take big groups of people who are infected with certain organisms, the way their lung function behaves is different from people without those organisms. So the trials are trying to sort of standardize things, if you like, so to get rid of some of the variability in the measurements and to give the trial the best chance of showing its proper potential. So that's the main reason for it.
Okay, thank you.
I think Francesca has her hand up again, so would you like to ask your question?
Yes, sorry, but I just have like a million questions. Going along with the exclusion criteria, would liver cirrhosis be one of the exclusion criteria to take part in trials?
Jane, would you like to follow up on that one?
Yes, I can, Francesca. I think it probably comes down to the degree of severity. So you're probably aware that cystic fibrosis related liver disease is a big spectrum through for very, very early changes that you can see through to people who actually are so badly affected that they end up needing a liver transplant because that's their worst organ. So that's a very big spectrum. I think the vast majority of clinical trials, particularly those ones where it's first into the population, will exclude people at the more severe and possibly also the moderate end of the liver cirrhosis spectrum. But certainly milder degrees may not be excluded. And just back to what I was saying about the fact that you might be excluded from a trial, I don't think that there's any expectation that these genetic therapies are going to further worsen the liver for any reason. So I don't think that there would be a problem in the future getting access to those drugs once they've come through the trials pipeline.
Thank you. One last question. Okay, sorry. Since I am from Malta, would there be any possibility of me taking part in these trials in the clinics abroad? I don't mind kind of traveling for them and everything. I've lived in Leeds myself, so to study there. So I'm just curious, you know.
Tim, since you're based in Leeds, would you like to answer that one?
So I think it's worth asking the question and exploring your particular circumstances, perhaps with your care centre in Malta, and if you're interested in UK clinical trials, perhaps with one of the centres in the UK that's running it. I think what we say about wanting everyone to be able to access clinical trials holds for wherever they are. I think there are some logistical difficulties about cross-border recruitment, but I think the thing to do is ask the question, and people will see what can be done.
Thank you very much, guys. Really lightened my head a bit. Thank you.
Thank you. I realise we're 1 minute to the end of our time, so I think we'll close the questions there. I think we will try and get answers out somehow to anyone who hasn't had their question answered, including some of the pre-submitted questions, as long as the panel are happy to submit some answers to those. But just want to say a huge thank you to everybody that's attended this evening, and thank you as well to the three panelists, Jamie, Jane and Tim, for your time and for answering some of these really good and really interesting questions. It's been a really valuable event, and we hope it's been valuable to you as attendees as well. And thanks also to my co-chair Michelle for doing a great job, and the organisers behind the scenes as well, for allowing the event to run smoothly. We'll be sharing a questionnaire, I think, in the chat, just to gather some feedback on the event and help us plan future events. And there should be a handy slide has come up now on some upcoming events. We have a community information evening, or 2 evenings. I think they're held online but also in person in Belfast and Glasgow on the 20th and 21st of June, and there will be links via the link in the slide to register for those. And we also have another upcoming CF Live event all around gut health, which will be on the 26th of June, again in the evening, for anyone who's interested in registering for that. So I believe that's everything. We will send out a recording of this event for anybody that wants to watch this again or watch on catch up. And yeah, I will say thank you and have a lovely evening to everybody. Thanks for coming.